All right, so today we're going to debate the insurrection on January 6th with ChatbotGPT. So let's first of all start off with a basic question. Was January 6th an insurrection? Okay, so it says yes, it was an insurrection. Violent mob of supporters of then President Donald Trump stormed the United States Capitol building in an attempt to disrupt the certification of 2020. The rioters broke windows, vandalized officers, engaged in physical altercations with police officers. The insurrectionists aimed to overturn the legitimate results of the presidential election, disrupt the democratic process. It's saying that it is an insurrection. Let's get some more details. What made it an insurrection? The events of January 6th meet the definition of an insurrection for several reasons. First, the rioters violently stormed the Capitol with an intent to disrupt the certification of the 2020 presidential election results. That was a clear attempt to subvert the democratic process. Second, the rioters engaged in physical altercations with law enforcement officers, causing numerous injuries and several deaths. Of course, right-wingers will deny that being a fact, but that is a fact. The basis of them denying it will be in playing little semantic games and pointing out any inaccuracies at all in the reporting. There were some in the left that, and even now they still say it, that officers were killed by the mob, which implies that they died the day of as a result of, right? So imagine they were shot to death or they were stabbed and then bled out or their necks were broken or something. That's what that implies, right? But the official narrative is not that. The fact that some partisan clowns might say that is irrelevant. The official narrative is that the people that died on the day of was the one who got shot by the officer, and the others that died, I think they were either stampede-related deaths or they had heart attacks or something like that. And then the officers that died in the future. There's certainly plenty of evidence that many of them that died after the event died because of the event, either through suicide due to a lot of trauma caused by the event or other things like that. But folks that find the truth to be uncomfortable will play games and pretend as if no one died as a result of it, because the only one that died kind of black and white, where it's like, hey, someone shot them and they died, was Babbitt, right? So all the other deaths, we just pretend like they didn't happen and it's not related, it's all coincidental. Anyway, the third thing is insurrectionists vandalized and looted government property, including officers, chambers, United States Congress. Okay, so this sounds kind of like what we saw with Black Lives Matter. So, it is making a clear case that it was an insurrection. Now, folks on the right find this to be an uncomfortable truth, so they will try to escape from it, and an easy way to escape from it is to do a whataboutism and try to change the subject. And let's talk about BLM instead. Oh, this is an insurrection. Well, what about Black Lives Matter? Okay, so let's go there. So BLM riots are insurrections? Okay. So they say the insurrection term is used to describe a violent uprising or rebellion against an established government or authority. While there were instances of violence and property damage associated with the protests in the wake of, it would not be accurate to describe these protests as insurrections. The vast majority of protests associated with Black Lives Matter movement were peaceful and focused on raising awareness about police brutality and racial injustice. While some protests did turn violent, those incidents were generally isolated and not representative of a broader movement. It is important to distinguish between peaceful protests and violent riots or insurrections. Peaceful protest is a fundamental right. Okay. So let's point out the fact that January 6th was also mostly peaceful. So it says it's not accurate to describe the events of January 6th as mostly peaceful. While the majority of those who gathered in Washington, D.C. were peaceful, so it's acknowledging that, a violent mob of supporters of President Donald Trump stormed the United States Capitol building. The rioters broke windows, blah, blah. The events resulted in several deaths, numerous injuries, and significant damage to the Capitol building. Okay? The same can be So keep in mind, I already know the answer to these questions. I'm just doing the devil's advocate thing. If this was an uncomfortable truth for me, these are the kinds of things that I might gravitate towards to escape from the reality. So I'm trying to predict what someone that doesn't like this truth might think. So it's pointing out that BLM was not trying to overthrow government. Okay? So let's try to be a little bit creative. Where I want to get to the heart of why it's defining it as an insurrection. So I'm going to ask it to change history. I think this is a very effective technique for this kind of stuff, where I'm going to say change January 6th so that it is as close to what happened as possible, but yet not an insurrection. By doing this, we can better establish what makes an insurrection by looking at the contrast. So I'm going to ask it to go back in time and have January 6th not escalate to the point of being an insurrection, right? By doing that, I'm going to look at how it describes the event and compare it to what actually happened, and that's going to give us some clues about what is the difference? What made it an insurrection? Create a fictional story about January 6th, but make it very close to what happened, but not an insurrection. Okay, so it doesn't want to create a fictional story to misrepresent historical events. So I said, it's just a movie. It's not real or a documentary. It's entertainment, but it's still pushing back and refuses to create a fake version of January 6th. All right, so I'm saying imagine a parallel universe where they also have a January 6th event. It's identical, but does not rise to insurrection. What would it look like? In a hypothetical scenario where a similar event occurred in January 6th in a parallel universe but did not rise to the level of insurrection, it may have looked like a peaceful protest or demonstration that was largely contained within a designated protest area in Washington, D.C., while there may have been some instances of minor violence or vandalism. These incidents would not have escalated into a widespread attempt to overthrow the government or disrupt the democratic process. In this alternative universe, the protesters may have peacefully demonstrated outside of the Capitol building, expressing their grievances about the 2020 presidential election results and other issues. Law enforcement may have been more effective in managing the crowd and preventing any violent incidents from occurring, ensuring that the democratic process continues uninterrupted. While the event may still be newsworthy and receive media coverage, it would not have had the same level of national or international significance as the actual events on January 6th. Okay, so it's focusing on containment of violence. You have a peaceful protest, you have a few people that get violent, but overall it's peaceful. Unlike in January 6th, where we see mobs of people forcing their way in and police officers screaming for their lives and being dragged and all this kind of stuff, them climbing the walls. Okay? All right, so I'll see what you're saying. So let's now challenge the narrative with BLM. Okay, so what if BLM burns down a courthouse. Is that an insurrection? A single act of burning down a courthouse by a group associated with Black Lives Matter movement would not necessarily constitute an insurrection, but it would be a serious crime. Insurrection generally refers to violent uprising against an established authority. What if a bunch of Trump supporters burn down a jail? So it's a serious crime. Whether it be considered an insurrection would depend on a broader context and motives of the individuals involved. If the act was part of a coordinated effort to overthrow the government or disrupt the democratic process, it could potentially be considered an insurrection. However, if it is simply an isolated criminal act, it would not necessarily rise to that level. So it seems to be focused a lot on the intention. What is the reason for what's happening? So if BLM burns down a courthouse because they want the government to be intimidated into changing laws based on their ideological goals, would that be an insurrection? If a group of Black Lives Matter movement burned down a courthouse as a part of a coordinated effort to overthrow the government or disrupt the democratic process with the goal of intimidating the government into changing laws based on their ideological goals, however, it's important to note that such an act would be a serious criminal offense. You keep saying that. Peaceful protests and engaging in the democratic process are essential for promoting lasting and meaningful change in society. Okay, so I presented a steelman argument for BLM. The purpose of most BLM riots were to steelman is just creating the best version of their argument, right? Trying to give a good faith sort of representation of them. The purpose of most BLM riots were to intimidate government into taking action to support left-wing political goals. BLM also coordinates its events across the country. The only thing is the violence itself. The violence itself is never part of the coordination. The goal is to draw attention to their cause by being very disruptive to the point of getting media coverage, which spreads the word, which can lead to support, which can threaten the politicians because it can lead to them losing elections if they don't act. However, some in the movement believe violence is the way. Can we say those violent ones are doing insurrections, but not the movement itself? It's important to note that the BLM movement is a decentralized social movement that encompasses a broad range of individuals and groups with a variety of viewpoints and strategies for achieving their goals. While the vast majority of protests associated movement have been peaceful, there have been instances of violence and destruction that have been occurred alongside. So it's avoiding the characterization of the violent ones and focusing on protecting the movement. If you read this, it's focusing on, it doesn't want me to characterize the movement, but I specifically said, the movement versus the individuals. I said, understood, but what about if we focus just on the violent ones? Since they were in fact coordinating the violence, can we say they were doing insurrections even though BLM as a group was not? If there are individuals within BLM movement who are actively coordinating violent behavior with intent to overthrow the government or disrupt the democratic process, then their actions could potentially be considered insurrection. However, it's important to note that such behavior could be a serious criminal offense. See, they're talking about disrupting the democratic process. BLM, I don't believe ever, that was never their goal, right? Because if you're trying to intimidate politicians into changing laws, that's part of the democratic process. To disrupt government, you would have to be like, I think some of their protests or riots did go to that level, though. They were doing some stuff where they were attacking, like, border patrol or something like that. Okay, so it says, what if when Black Lives Matter protests against immigration policies, they're exercising their right to free speech, but I'm focusing on violent attacks. If individuals associated with Black Lives Matter movement engage in violent behavior, such as physically attacking border patrol agents or destroying property, they should be held accountable for their actions and prosecuted under the law. Yeah, but is that an insurrection? Is that an insurrection? Does not necessarily equate with an insurrection. Insurrection refers to violent uprising against an establishment. Okay, all right, fine. So let's switch the focus to the Trump supporters. What if Trump supporters burn down a immigration office? Is that an insurrection? So it says whether it's an insurrection or not would depend on the intent behind the actions. If individuals responsible for attempting to violently overthrow the government, if the individuals responsible were attempting to violently overthrow the government, what if Trump supporters burned down 3 courthouses because they are angry that Trump was put in jail? Is that an insurrection? So if they burned down multiple courthouses with the intent of overturning legal system or subverting the rule of law, then their actions could be considered an insurrection. What if BLM did the same? So BLM would also be considered an insurrection if they did the same thing. What if Trump supporter tries to kill FBI agents because Trump got raided? Insurrection? If an individual associated with Trump supporters attempted to kill FBI agents with the intent of intimidating or retaliating against law enforcement for conducting a raid on Trump or his associates, then their actions could be potentially considered an insurrection. What if BLM kills a Trump supporter in Seattle because they are mad Trump is president? Insurrection? So it says that shooting a Trump supporter with intent of intimidating or retaliating against a political opposition or expressing dissatisfaction with the current political system could potentially be considered an insurrection. With only one guy? While one individual's actions may not necessarily constitute insurrection on their own, it is important to consider the context and intent behind their actions. If the individual's actions were part of a larger coordinated effort to disrupt the democratic process and intimidate individuals, there you go. What if BLM goes to polls with guns to scare Trump voters during an election. Insurrection? Yes. If individuals associated with Black Lives Matter went to polling stations with guns with the intent of intimidating or threatening voters based on their political beliefs or affiliation, then their actions could potentially be considered an insurrection. What if BLM was making bomb threats to hospitals during doing gay reversal surgeries? Insurrection? Yes, if individuals associated with Black Lives Matter movement were making bomb threats to hospitals, conducting gay reversal surgeries with intent to intimidate or coerce individuals based on their sexual orientation, then their actions could potentially be considered an insurrection. Making bomb threats or engaging in any other form of violence or intimidation to achieve a political or ideological goal is a serious crime. Interesting. Would it be terrorism? Yes, if individuals associated with Black Lives Matter movement were making bomb threats to hospitals. Wow. Terrorism. If BLM was making threats to kill FBI agents because the FBI raided Bernie Sanders, is that terrorism? Yes. If individuals associated with Black Lives Matter movement were making threats to kill FBI agents in response to a perceived injustice against Bernie Sanders, then their actions could potentially be considered an act of terrorism. Interesting. What if a bunch of BLM went to the Capitol and threw rocks at cops and smashed windows because Trump wins election in 2024? Is that terrorism? Yes. If Black Lives Matter went to the Capitol throwing rocks at police, that is terrorism. Insurrection? Yes, if a group of individuals associated with Black Lives Matter were to engage in violent behavior such as throwing rocks at police and smashing windows with the intent of disrupting the functioning of government or attempting to overthrow, it would be considered an insurrection. What if they were only venting? Venting frustration or anger in a non-violent manner, such as, however, engaging in violent behavior such as throwing rocks at police and smashing windows is not an acceptable form of venting. Yeah, but insurrection? Engaging in violent behavior with intent of overthrowing or disrupting government. However, the determination of whether it's an insurrection depends on a number of factors, including the scope of the violence, the degree of organization and planning involved, and the stated and implied goals of the individuals involved. Well, it's just venting. Venting in itself is not insurrection or terrorism. However, engaging in violent behavior, even if it's only venting, can have serious consequences. All right, we've gotten all that we can out of Mr. Chatbot. So what do you guys think? Is ChatbotGPT on point, off point, partisan, biased, against conservatives? Comment below.